I was never supposed to view the message that started it. Friday a.m., 6:52 a.m. My phone buzzed once, and then again while I was brewing coffee in my small kitchen, the kind where the counter is just large enough to fit a mug and a cutting board. Trying to recover from another sleepless night that leaves your eyes open, but your body feeling hollow, I got up early. I mistook it for an update on shipping. For my print studio, I had placed an order for new ink. However, the preview struck me like a punch as I glanced down at the screen. We'll ensure she doesn't appear. I won't include her name in the finished drawings. You manage the press. Marin sent it. To Jules. Not me? Jules. My fiancé. Marin. My sister. I had accidentally received the thread. In a fit of early morning conceit, someone must have tapped the incorrect name. Or perhaps they no longer cared if I ever found out. There it was, however, as if they hadn't just destroyed 10 years of my life in 6 seconds. The words sat silently on my lock screen. I refrained from crying. Didn't yell. The hiss of the stovetop kettle rose behind me like a warning as I stood there holding the coffee pot in midair. The room was filled with the pungent, harsh smell of burnt grounds. Those 23 phrases were seared into the back of my eyelids as my gaze remained fixated on them. She doesn't appear. Her name remains unspoken. I put the pot down carefully, as if I didn't want to make a sound. My hands were shaking, but not in a bad way. Rather, they were pulsing slowly at the fingertips, as if something had just woken up from a deep sleep. I should have been surprised. In actuality, though, I had been preparing for this for months, perhaps even longer. The signals were not overt. A correction there, a comment here. On the design credits I had begun my name was subtly changed. Jules' soothing voice led the audience as I repitched my ideas in meetings, subtly rewording them. What about Marin? She always viewed my work as though it were a draft that she hadn't yet given her approval to. The Everest Collection was the name given to it. My idea, my research, and my initial prototypes were for a line of custom-printed silks that were influenced by high-altitude plants. We planned to make its premiere at the West Coast's biggest independent design show. A turning point. The type you strive for throughout your life. But suddenly, it wasn't us. They were the ones. They also had plans. I looked at the thread once more. Don't apologize. Without hesitation. Only the logistics. Plan. As if I were a smudge that needed to be removed from the frame. The screen dimmed. Hours passed before I touched it again. With my coffee cold, I sat at the kitchen table and gazed at the wall. I'm only hearing things, not seeing them. Not really sounds. Like echoes, actually. I had always stood up for them. Every time I swallowed the pain of being ignored, replaced, or degraded, I had responded, "No, I'm sure it was just a mix-up." And I had the proof now. I went the extra mile to the studio that afternoon, while the city was bustling outside. I went by the print shop where I was initially taught how to manually pull screens. After school, Marin and I would split wildflowers at the florist. It all had the same appearance. However, I was different. And I wasn't going to work this time. I was about to vanish. Not in a big way. Not in rage or flames. Only a silent extraction. Similar to taking out a stitch that never healed properly. My corner of the studio remained untouched. The ink wall. My notebooks. I used the small porcelain elephant as a paperweight. However, I was aware that I shouldn't presume that everything was still mine. I opened the drawer containing my early sketches. Lost. The screen frames of the prototype also gone. The inventory logs have been cleaned of my initials. Only 2 founders were identified in the most recent press release on the company tablet. Marin and Jules. Not me. Not the one who had once spent 3 consecutive nights mixing the ideal periwinkle. Not the one who had raised the down payment for this lease by selling her grandmother's sewing machine. I had already been deleted. Nevertheless, they continued to carry it out. On Sunday, the launch event was scheduled. I had witnessed the invitation being sent out with Marin's signature embossed in gold. An oddly familiar remark appeared in Jules's updated bio since I owned it. Something I once casually mentioned in an interview. Adding isn't what design is. It's what you decide not to include. It was theirs now. I didn't take anything with me as I left the studio. Not quite yet. I wasn't prepared. This time I wasn't going to react, not because I was afraid. I intended to record, watch, make a plan, then stealthily reclaim all they attempted to take. But first, I traveled to the ancient house where my great-aunt used to reside, next to the salt flats on the outskirts of the city. Now it was deserted. The margins are crumbling. However, there was still one item they were unable to touch. The letterpress. The first one. Back when women weren't supposed to have blueprints in their back pockets or ink-stained palms, my great-aunt constructed the first one herself. That press was a legacy as much as a tool. My heritage. I touched the cool metal of the frame and the weathered wooden handle. Sitting in the bottom drawer, there it was, the stamp of signature carved by hand. Transmitted. Mine. I'm still here, still whole. Under ash like a pulse. I made the decision at that point that I would not combat them in the manner that they had anticipated. Not with controversy. Not by yelling. I was going to follow the instructions. Print the truth. Layer by layer. Ink by ink. Till it was impossible to ignore. I grabbed the stamp and held it up to the light source. 3 interlocking stylish and clearly mine letters make up a stylized monogram, an emblem. Not alone in what they attempted to destroy, but what I was going to get back. They assumed I would disappear like an error, one of those first drafts you rip out and throw away without looking again. And I allowed them to believe that. That was the idea. I didn't leave all at once, failed to deliver a message. I simply stopped being present. Wrapped in a strip of indigo cotton, one of the test prints from our first batch together. I just left the studio key on the front desk one morning. Not a word. No justification. Jules didn't call. Marin made no pretense of checking in. Not even because of guilt. They seemed to have been waiting for me to finally move aside in silence so they could take center stage without any shadows. They were unaware, however, that I didn't back down in embarrassment. I took a step back to construct. I vanished into the areas that people overlook. Print shops in little towns where the machines still moaned like elderly men. Artist getaways where only your ink-stained hands were requested, not your Instagram. I slept in small attic rooms that smelled of rain and lavender on pull-out couches, and in trailers next to deserted vineyards. I also worked. I worked God. I improved the color schemes they had taken, reconstructed the patterns from the ground up this time, using a unique beat that was bone deep and impossible to replicate. I learned new techniques on my own, such as hand-cut linoleum blocks, dye-resist layering, and even color produced from crushed stone and dirt. The kind that appeared lifeless until it was perfectly illuminated. Like me, sort of. Not in an ostentatious viral manner, people started to take notice. In murmurs. In forums at night. Fenroot is a woman who sells limited edition prints. I realize that's an odd name, but it was inspired by an old tale my great-aunt used to share about a plant that can withstand severe winters by sending roots so deep they may reach ancient rivers. Now I was that. Deep. Keep quiet. Unchangeable. I never uploaded any pictures. My true name was never utilized. My old family monogram is the only sign that is stamped in the corner of each piece. The one with the stamp of signature. The one they believed their ambition had buried. In Seattle, it appeared on gallery walls. In Kyoto, on handcrafted scarves. On the covers of journals in a little Vermont bookshop. Constantly understated, always hidden, but always present. Collectors then started to wonder, Who is this? I didn't respond, as I wasn't yet prepared. I chose to listen instead. Observed. Waited. I looked at their website every couple of months. They claimed that the Everest collection had changed. The textures, however, were flat. The colors are too enthusiastic. I first heard Jules acknowledge, even in passing, that I had once been a part of the tale when he spoke about collaborative inspiration and honoring invisible partners at a design summit. However, I wasn't broken by that. It was the statement that appeared beside a picture of Marin at a press conference. The original Everest visionary. Original, imaginative, behind. These 3 words were more scathing than any confession. I had trouble sleeping that night. Not out of anger, but from sorrow. Something grew beneath the ribs, a strange, familiar agony that seemed to be attempting to dig itself out. Sitting up in the dark, I listened to the sound of the wind hitting the glass. Beside me, my laptop blazed like a far-off wildfire. After years of not touching anything, I opened a file. When I originally had the idea for Everest, I created a digital scrapbook. I used to call it Sky Route. I scanned pages of pressed flowers from it. Symbolism notes in the margins. Possible textile pattern blueprints. I even recorded a shaky, grainy video of me explaining the idea to Jules as Marin recorded on her phone. I hit the play button. I sounded eager in the video. Anxious. The belief you could hear it. That brittle, unadulterated faith that those by your side wish to construct alongside you, not above you. Jules had given a silent nod of approval. "You're the real deal, sis," Marin exclaimed after zooming in too closely. I'd never be able to think that way. And yet here we were. I ought to have removed the file. I should have shut down the laptop and returned to my sleep. Instead, though, I clicked export. A copy was then saved to an encrypted disk. Next, another to a cloud backup folder, just in case. Not to exact revenge, just so you know, because they weren't just trying to replace me. It was to remove the evidence of my actions, to reorganize the narrative till it resembled the architect's and my draft, which was not included in the final cut. However, I had something that they didn't. Recall.documentation.time. So I waited. Until the murmurs became more intense. Until Fenroot was requested to license a design by a posh New York store. Until my monogram was linked to a limited edition zine I had made in Michigan by a curator from a museum in Oslo. Until the following headline appeared on the cover of an independent arts journal featuring my great-aunt's press, "The Silent Revival, an ink-based movement." I realized then. Time was drawing near. Retaliation that was yelled was not what I needed. I required one that was irrevocable. Truth that was too deeply ingrained to be scrubbed was what I needed. The paper was the first step. Actual paper. Handmade in a basement press using water from the adjacent lake, this cotton blend has decal borders. One copy of my original Skyroot file was printed. Time-stamped on each page. I signed each note with my initials. Every annotated draft, every scanned petal. Additionally, on the final page, Spring 2018, designed by Helena Reeve. My true name. They had forgotten to be afraid of it. I folded it once, put it into a blue cloth-lined box, and connected it with the original Everest color of the thread, which Marin, without blinking, nicknamed Arctic Bloom. The only individual I knew who was still employed at their studio was then the recipient of the package. Luca, the silent intern who was always aware of everything, but remained silent. I wrote a note inside. Once you inquired about the origins of the designs. This is your response. Sooner more. H, with thread still stuck beneath my fingernails and ink on my palms. I walked out of the post office, and I felt seen for the first time in years, even though nobody has checked yet, even though I remained unseen. Because what's different now, I was afraid, so I wasn't silent. I was silent since I was getting ready, and louder than any TED Talk news release or award speech they could give one another, was what I had evidence, and the endurance to allow it to rise slowly and unabated like water and ink. I didn't cause the first ripple. It originated with the Oslo Museum's assistant curator. One of my first prints, a silk panel placed under glass, was the only image she shared on Instagram, and she tagged Fenrud in it. She had typed underneath it a work that was created 3 years before the Everest collection. The same motif, the same color, a different name. That was all. Don't use hashtags. No charges. Not a drama. However many took notice. Design blogs began to pose queries. 2 graduate students shared side-by-side comparisons on social media. Dates, swatches, overlays for sketches. Then, years before Marin and Jules ever brought up Everest in an interview, someone found a snapshot from an old forum where I had initially shared my sky route idea. The comments section sprung to life. Phrases like exploitation appropriation and plagiarism began to appear. First, quiet. Then, it gets louder. I remained silent, though. I didn't have to. I was getting ready for another thing. They celebrated 5 years of design innovation with their Everest anniversary banquet that Sunday, where guests donned linen and shared philosophical quotes while sipping wine. It was held at a downtown rooftop gallery that was all glass and shadow, the kind of place designed to make entrepreneurs appear modest and artists look wealthy. I didn't go. Wasn't asked. Naturally. However, Luca did. Luca also wore something out of the ordinary. A plain scarf made of silk, dyed by hand, featuring one of the original Skyroute motifs on the print. My little unobtrusive signature stamped in the corner. It was like armor on them. One of the event's photos was leaked. Marin is standing next to Jules at the podium. Luca was in the crowd, his scarf on display, his gaze focused on the screen behind them rather than the speakers, where the gallery tech malfunctioned midway through their speech. Flickered. Restarted. A new file was then loaded. One nobody anticipated. Origins, an independent archive of the early history of Everest. A time-lapse of my former workspace, the prototypes and my voice explaining each step was shown first. Journal scans follow. Formulas for colors, dates, places, footage from the days of the garage. Me using my hands to mix dyes. Jules gives a nod. Marin is filming. At first, the crowd did not respond. Then the whispers began. Then there was quiet. Then there are whispers once more, this time more acute. There was a nervous laugh. Another got up and walked away. I didn't post anything at all, though. A reporter from Design Ethics Weekly contacted me directly the same evening. How she found my email is a mystery to me. But she didn't say much. Enough has been seen. Tell us your version, please. Are you going to allow us? I didn't answer for 2 days. When I did, I said, yes, but with conditions. Avoid sensationalism. No quotes have been altered. No ostentatious pictures. I would meet face to face. I would present the archive, but only if they consented to add my great-aunt's tale as well. The press is beginning. They attempted to bury me along with my legacy. An antique library's calm corner served as the setting for the interview. I wore black, easy, tidy. I wore a tiny rope around my neck with a carved signature stamp as my lone adornment. The author did more listening than talking, took handwritten notes, asked tactful questions, and let the heavy lifting be done by silence. She uttered something unexpected in the end. They did more than simply take your work. They attempted to take advantage of your quiet to further their own agenda. I gave a nod. Because it's true. They did precisely that. They hadn't simply wiped me out. They had turned my inaction into a weapon, used my self-control as authorization. However, that only works if I don't return. And my absence was over. A week later, the article was published. Title: The Ghost in the Silk, The Silent Revolution of Helena Reeve. It revealed everything: the theft from the studio, the redirections for licensing, the fraudulent credits, the initial files, the scarf, the stamp. They even published my original diary article and Marin's press quotes side by side. She had stated, "Design is subtraction." I had written, "Design isn't what you add." My own words, repainted. The public's reaction was more incisive than I anticipated. Not upset, exactly. The sort of indignation that changed rather than screamed. People began to stop working together. Similar actions by Jules in his previous work were the subject of several articles. For health reasons, Marin canceled 2 forthcoming events. The legal letter then arrived, from their group to mine. A cease and desist. Defamation accusations. Allegations of a breach. I read the opening paragraph, then came to a standstill. There was no need for me to defend myself, since I had evidence. Furthermore, I was now in a position of power, actual power. Like roots, you construct it from the ground up. The kind you use as a compass, not a weapon, and that you get better with time. So, I answered in a single sentence. You are free to take this to court. I then included a link. It led to a drive that was encrypted. All of the design drafts were included. Each and every invoice, each and every video, each voice memo, time-stamped. Each one is watermarked. All of this was confirmed by third-party copyright logs that I had discreetly submitted under the name Fenroot LLC for the previous 2 years. I never received a response. Rather, I received a different email 3 days later from a Blue Ridge Mountains charity art residency. The article had been read by them. I enjoyed my job and wanted to give me a fellowship for a year so I could rebuild, study, and teach on my own. Not a press. No press, only room. Time too. Yes, I replied, and I only brought 3 items from my previous life when I packed. The margins of the carved stamp are now smooth. The inkstone of my great-aunt, cracked but still functional. They mailed me the scarf that Luca wore to the event, along with a note that said, "They're falling apart. There's no reason to pull. Continue weaving." So I did. I wove, and I started over. However, I wasn't invisible this time. There was no denying me. The land welcomed me before the people did when I got to the Blue Ridge Mountains residence. There wasn't a sense of emptiness to the silence. It was a breathing silence. Trees are like old friends, a creek that didn't have to be loud to whisper. They offered me a cottage without a TV or internet. Only a long wooden desk, a kettle, and a skylight that reflected moonlight like a bowl. I actually didn't bring my previous life with me. Only the inkstone, the scarf, and the carved stamp. I left everything else where it belonged in old headlines that were already starting to turn yellow around the edges, in files and in sealed boxes. In the mornings, I mixed local soil with paints. I spent the afternoons pushing leaves into my sketchbook while strolling along the ridgeline trails, using lamplight nights, create new patterns. My name, Helen Reeve, started to show up in workshop circuits, artist newsletters, and even some international mailers. None of it was noisy, though. It moved slowly, rooted, similar to a tide that continues to rise without breaking. Then I received an envelope one early spring morning. The color is cream, embossed, official. Reeve Tarson Design Awards was the return address. They developed a category that year called Independent Design Legacy, and my name was on the list of finalists. A silent nod, maybe. A sacrifice for peace. Or simply effective PR. However, it made no difference why. The time had come. Portland would host the ceremony. Since things fell apart, I hadn't returned to the West. Perhaps I would never go again, I thought. But something changed in me, not pride nor anger, when I held that package. Nothing but silence, the kind you get when the winds cease fighting with you at last. I took light travel, only the necessities. I kept my trip a secret from everyone, not even Luca. There are some pathways you take by yourself, not because you have to, but because it's important to feel your own weight once more. As only coastal cities can be, Portland was gray, damp light, the air is sharp. The location was on top of a former textile museum that was converted into a gallery with glass walls, wide beams, and polished flooring that smelled of eucalyptus oil. My hair was still wet from the rain when I arrived right before the event began. No cosmetics, no entourage. It was just me in my black linen suit with the carved stamp subtly stitched into the inside lining of my coat and the scarf knotted loosely around my neck. A few heads turned when I entered the gallery. A few stayed. A few turned their heads away. Then I caught sight of them. Jules and Marin, still bound together by injury, ambition, and whatever form of love they had perverted into an excuse. Jules had thinning hair. Marin grinned more firmly. They didn't come close. Not right away. However, I sensed the seriousness of their eyes. Like static on an ancient radio dial, I could feel the query reverberating throughout the room. "She's here, but why?" And I replied silently. I strolled over to the wall of installation. I had already done my assignment. A full-scale silk panel with hand-cut designs that repeat like breath and layers of indigo and earth paints. Not a plaque. There's only one stamp in the corner. HRI spent some time standing in front of it, long enough for the muttering to stop and the lights to change. I turned after that and moved in their direction. Like a deer caught in dusk, Marin tensed up, not knowing whether to flee or act as though she had never been there. Jules first made an effort to become better. "Helena," he said. There was always a faint lilt in his voice, as if he were giving you a secret. "I didn't think you would be here," I gave a nod. "You didn't have high expectations of me. That was the issue." A slight flinch went through him. Marin's mouth parted, then closed again. Maybe she was looking for an escape. Maybe she was looking for witnesses. However, I wasn't here to cause a stir. I had a point to make. I reached into my coat and took out a tiny envelope. A printed page inside. The old shared server's metadata log. The one they overlooked. It provided information about the Skyroot folder's initial timestamp. My uploads. My drafts. Additionally, they silently access copy and rename their logins. I extended it to Marin. She refused to accept it. "It's not for court," I said. "For your mirror," I said. Jules took a step forward. "This makes no difference." "Calm as the dark?" I grinned. It did already. Simply put, you weren't looking. Then I turned to leave. Not in a hurry. Not victorious. Just finished. I located my chair in the rear of the space. The show started. The nominees were introduced by the host, and I stood up when they called my name clearly without being dramatic or loud. Not for them. For her. The me who sat at a kitchen table 3 years ago, reading a message she was never supposed to see, coffee-cold fingers quivering. In a single sentence, I accepted the award. Legacy is what you preserve while you're still here, not what you leave behind. I then took a step back. I removed my shoes and draped the scarf over the chair when I returned to my hotel room later that evening. On the dresser, right beneath the lamp, lay the carved stamp. I brushed my thumb over the grain, which had been polished by time, hands, and memories. I was no longer required to press it. Quiet, steady, and persistent, the mark had already spread. For years they had danced in the light. However, I had constructed the floor myself. It was mine once more now. 3 months later, I watched the ink dry on the wall, while standing barefoot on warm stone in the shadow of a twisted pecan tree. The place wasn't a gallery. It wasn't a studio. Outside of Santa Fe on a deserted hill was a converted barn where the sky was broader than uncertainty and the wind didn't ask questions. It was known as Root Light. I chose this name because it felt right, not because it sounded poetic. Light eventually finds roots where they grow, even below earth. It wasn't built for legacy by me. For repose, I created it. For artists who had never been heard. For makers who were informed that their hands lacked sufficient stability. For women who had sacrificed too much for the sake of devotion, love, or maintaining harmony. The opening was not reported in the headlines. The address was not tagged by any influencers. I only sent a few names I recalled from the years in between a handwritten note on recycled paper. People who once recognized my print in a bookstore corner and whispered, "Thank you." Those who caught sight of me when I was trying to blend in. There were 4 women in the first week. They had battered hearts, bits of fabric, damaged laptops, and old sketchbooks. We prepared tea. We were silent. After that, we created things. The wind was etched into woodblock patterns by one woman. Poems were sewn onto linen by another. For the first 5 days, she remained silent and simply strolled barefoot along the trail behind the barn, as if the land were healing her. And me, I made a print. Not for customers. Not for performances. Echoes of the Stolen is a series that I printed. Not upset. Not too loud. Reversed, rewritten, retold, just silent repetitions of patterns they attempted to claim. Each one had a single stamp in the lower corner, HR, subsequently put in a drawer, not available for purchase. Right there, similar to evidence, similar to breath. I discovered a tiny envelope hidden beneath the barn door one evening as the sun sank into the mesa. No name. One picture of me at 19 standing next to my great aunt at the press was inside. I was unaware that it had ever been stolen. I had a smile on my face. My cheeks are inked. She touched my shoulder. A blocky pencil note on the back reads, "You weren't supposed to be silent. You were designed to convey sound in a different way." Slowly, like it could speak again if I listened long enough, I traced the image's edges with my thumb. I sat with the others and ignited the fire pit that evening. An out-of-tune banjo was played. Another person hummed. We didn't discuss honor or treachery. We didn't have to. We were held in silence. Not the erasure's quietness. The quiet of being there. Of something coming back. Of a healing. I sat by myself and opened my journal later, after everyone had retired to their rooms, and the embers were glowing like memories. The carved signature stamp was sewn into the lining inside the cover. It no longer appeared to be a weapon. It appeared to be a key. I set it next to a sage sprig that I had already plucked from the garden. As though they recognized something, the leaves slowly curved toward the wood. Additionally, I wrote they attempted to extinguish the story. However, I was the match. I now light fires so that people can stay warm. The branches rustled in the breeze outside. This isn't a warning, a cadence, similar to footsteps, similar to a heartbeat, like the awakening of roots. A new woman showed up the following morning. There was nothing that she brought. She had no equipment, no suitcase, and she wasn't even prepared to give a name. Just the expression I used to have. Voice sunk someplace between responsibility and doubt, shoulders worn out. After giving her a mug of tea, I moved aside to make room for her. As if recalling her own form, she walked across the threshold. The sun behind her crept across the threshold and touched the gold flooring. Suddenly, another silent flame started.